Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 23 of the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the clue in the jewel box. So this is the 20th mystery in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1943. And I didn't remember anything about this book. I remember the cover distinctly, but I had no idea about the plot, so it was truly like reading an entirely new book for me. So, as always, I love to discuss the different book covers with you all before we get started, and if you all ever want to see these book covers, I'm always posting them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, Wednesday, before the podcast airs on Thursdays. So we've got 3 separate book covers that we're going to be discussing today, and the first edition of this cover just kind of shows Nancy, and again, she kind of looks like the Nancy from the Quest of the Missing Map. She's got the blonde kind of victory rolled hairstyle. She's got the matching blue skirt and suit set, and she's talking to an older woman who kind of looks like, what's the lady from Murder, She Wrote? Angela Lansbury. She looks like Angela Lansbury. She's very classy. She's got the pearl studded earrings, and she's got a jewel box that she's opened and is showing Nancy, and there's a little bird inside of it. And I don't know, just looking around at this woman's home, she's got some candlesticks, like she's apparently very wealthy. And we also see a man kind of lurking outside the window of the home and looking inside, which, that's not creepy at all. But that is what the first edition of this book cover looks like. It's honestly a pretty cool looking cover. It's really colorful. But if we go to the second edition of this cover, it's very similar. But again, this time we've got Nancy, and she's got the strawberry blonde hair. She's wearing a nice pink dress, and similar setup. She's talking to this older woman, and she's showing her this beautiful jewel box with the bird in it. And there's a guy outside the house, again, like peeping into the window, except he looks a little more sinister than the guy in the first edition of the cover. Now, in the third and final edition of the covers for The Clue in the Jewel Box, we have Nancy with the flipped out strawberry blonde hair. You can only see her from the waist up, but I'm assuming she's wearing like a pantsuit because that just seems like very 1970s to me, but I don't know. But we also have this floating head of this older woman, and she always looked like, I don't know, kind of scary to me as a kid. Her eyes, like she looks like she's seen some things. But then we've got the big pink jewel box with the bird in it right next to her head, and then the shadowy figure in the background. It's definitely more sketch-like in quality, but I don't know. This isn't the creepiest cover I've seen, but it definitely gets your attention. So one of my favorite things to do for this podcast is come up with a cover spoof for the books based on just the cover art. And sometimes I just go off of like, okay, if I'd never read this book, what would I think it's about? Or a lot of times I just play off of what's going on the cover because it's hilarious. So the cover spoof that I came up with for The Clue in the Jewel Box is, "So you see, darling, when I tell people I'm giving them the bird, this is what I mean." So, because there's this elderly woman, and she's, handing Nancy this little jewel box with a bird in it. I thought it was funny. Some of these cover spoofs just come to me, and then other times I'm asking my husband, what do you think would be a good cover spoof? Because sometimes I just draw a blank. But I will say that out of these 3 covers, I favor the first 2. I think those are way better done, and I gave those a 3 magnifying glass rating. And for the revised flashlight edition, the last cover, I gave it a 1. I don't know. I think it really depends on your style and what you like, but a lot of the 60s and 70s covers with Nancy's floating head and all these elements floating around the cover, they're just not my favorite. There's a few that I like, but a lot of them just kind of fall flat for me. So now we're going to jump into the characters that are in this book, because there's quite a few. So we, of course, have Hannah and Carson, and Bess and George are in this book at parts, but we also have Marie Alexandra. She is the older woman that's pictured on the cover, and of course, it turns out that she's royalty. We'll get to that in a second. But she has a maid named Anna, There is also a Mr. Faber. There is Francis Baum, who was a man who was pickpocketed in the book, Cordova, who is the actual pickpocket, and David Dorrance, who is an innocent pickpocket lookalike. So yeah, this is one of those books where there's a lot of cases of mistaken identity and lookalikes, and I'm not going to say I hate that. There's a few Nancy Drew books where I feel like they pull that plot off very well. I'll let you determine what I think about this aspect of the plot later on in the episode, but there's a lot of characters and a lot of names that get thrown around, so it kind of gets confusing. So I tried my best to write a good synopsis for this book. So, our story opens with Nancy looking for a birthday present for Carson in a jewelry store when she notices a woman, Marie Alexandra, sitting outside who looks sick. She, Bess, and George help the woman back to her house and see she has some expensive-looking decor. When they leave to grab lunch, they witness a man, Francis Baum, being pickpocketed. Nancy helps him get his wallet back, and when he leaves, he drops a picture of a boy wearing a sailor uniform that matches one Nancy saw in Marie Alexandra's purse. Nancy hears a story from Mr. Faber, an antique store owner, that Miss Alexandra is ex-royalty and is trying to locate her missing grandson. When Nancy, Bess, and George take tea at her house, she shows them a beautiful enamel Easter egg and tells her story herself. Nancy finds where the pickpocket lives, and he traps her in a telephone booth so she can't get away. Next is a series of confusing events where people are mistaken for other people. Francis Baum is actually Stanley Brandett, but pretending to be Michael Alexandra, a long-lost prince. But Richard Ellington, who was formerly Francis Baum, is actually Michael Alexandra. What the crap? So basically, this woman, who was ex-royalty, is reunited with her grandson, who is a prince. But yeah, all of that was so confusing. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for this book is Long Lost Prince Reunited with Queen. Also, local pickpocket gang busted. See page 7. This book was a little bit hard to follow with all of the different aliases and the lookalikes, but anyway, we will get right into the direct quotes and things that I wrote down about this book. So the first thing that I wrote down is we open with Nancy looking for something unique for her father's birthday, and the jewelry associate says, "Here's a handsome jewelry box that's a reproduction of one owned by a ruler in Europe years ago." I don't know, while I think it's sweet that Nancy's trying to find the perfect gift for Carson for his birthday, I feel like jewelry is just one of those things, like, I don't know. I don't like jewelry very much. Like, I love my wedding ring because of what it represents, but I just love cheap costume jewelry, so this is kind of lost on me. Or just really honestly, the weight of my heart is through vacations and chicken nuggets, but, you know, I'm not Carson Drew, so. Now, my next note just says, I think Marie Alexandra may be a play off of the Romanov royal family, so there's a lot of clues. You know, a lot of times in the Nancy Drew books, they will allude to, oh, you know, it might have to do with this country. Like, I think in The Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion, they hinted that the person trying to sabotage the NASA space program was from another country, and all clues, all points went towards Russia. But the reason I think this is alluding to Russia and the Romanov family, just Marie Alexandra, the name itself, Marie and Alexei were some of the children, aside from Anastasia, Olga, and Tatiana. And there's also this jewel box, which is shaped like an egg, and the Russian family, royal family, had quite a few of these eggs. I believe they were Fabergé, but there's a couple hints that kind of make me think that it's not outright saying, because usually if Nancy's dealing with anyone from another country or is another nationality, sometimes they just leave that up to the reader to decide where they're from. I also thought it was interesting that the antique shop owner is named Mr. Faber, and that kind of reminded me of Fabergé. I don't know if that was intentional, but that kind of caught my eye. And my next note said, this is further supported when the antique dealer reveals excitedly when Nancy shows him the sailor boy picture Francis Baum dropped and says, Miss Alexandra is looking for her grandson, whom she escaped to America with when their royal family's government was overthrown. I mean, this has Anastasia and the Romanov family written all over it. And when the Romanovs were killed by the Bolsheviks in 1918, after that, there were so many people that came forward pretending to be Anastasia or pretending to be members of the royal family. And I think it's really cool that some of the Nancy Drew books take actual historic things and kind of adapt them to Nancy's world and River Heights. It's so cool because the majority of this book's plot is this woman, Maria Alexandra, trying to find her grandson and then being duped by this man who is pretending to be her long-lost grandson. So I just thought that was really cool. Now, the next note that I took down is Nancy and her dad go to a father-daughter lawyer luncheon. And I thought this was cool. Like, Nancy got to spend a lot of time with her dad in this book, and that was just neat. I was like, oh, okay, so there's enough lawyers in the River Heights area, and enough of them have daughters that they just put on this luncheon, I guess. So the next thing that I took note of is Nancy jumps on a ferry to follow the pickpocket, and the ship runs into another ship. We're up to like 7 boat disasters now. Like, I look for them in all these books. Like, I swear, even if there's not a boat on the cover, I'm like, if Nancy gets on a boat or any body of water, bad things are going to happen to her. There's also this really funny scene where the pickpocket runs at Nancy in an apartment building because she was tailing him. And so she runs away from him because, yeah, she doesn't know what he's going to do to her. He could hurt her or kidnap her or worse. And so she hides in a telephone booth only for him to wedge something in the door so she can't get out. So she's like yelling and trying to get out until someone comes to help her. I thought that was pretty entertaining. But there's also a scene where a truck comes barreling into the jewelry store that Nancy's in. And I said, now we're up to, I believe, 6 times of almost being hit by a car. Like, disaster follows Nancy wherever she goes. My next note is Helen Corning Archer is back. So apparently she went on a trip to Europe and she brought back a woman, which I thought was weird. Someone named Catherine Kovna, an aspiring dressmaker. And I said, most people just bring home a t-shirt when they go on vacation, not a whole entire person. So there's this whole scene where Nancy starts humming this Nightingale song from Miss Alexandra's Easter egg jewel box thing, and Catherine says it's from her country. And later she determines and tells Nancy it's saying clue in the jewel box because the little bird is making some noises. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy comes home to see a man who looks like the pickpocket aiming a gun at Carson. So she throws a rock to disarm him. And it turns out that the man is David Dorrance, who looks like the pickpocket but isn't. And he apparently sells guns. So this is where a lot of confusion comes in. This guy, David Dorrance, looks just like this pickpocket that Nancy keeps encountering. And this was so confusing in this book. I was just like, is this the real pickpocket? What's happening? It was just a lot. But that was some super quick thinking on Nancy's part because there's this man she's never seen before pointing a gun at her dad. I'm just like, even if you're a gun salesman, you should know better than to point a gun at somebody. You don't do that, loaded or unloaded. But it turns out, that Carson wasn't in any danger, but still. Good job, Nancy. So this next thing that I wrote down is a direct quote from the book, and it says, though Nancy had many admirers, she admitted to herself that Ned was her favorite. So I thought that was cool. I thought that was very sweet because a lot of times in these books, I've noticed a trend of Ned really just professing his love for Nancy, and Nancy's always like, okay, cool, but I gotta go solve a mystery. So this was a neat kind of thing to pick up on in this book. Also, Ned gets jealous of the prince Nancy has helped find and says, I wish he'd stay missing. And Ned takes Nancy to a carnival and they ride a roller coaster, and it says, Nancy clung to Ned. He enjoyed this so much that he suggested a second ride. So I don't really remember much from my childhood, but this is probably as steamy as these Nancy Drew books get, the originals. I think it's really the Nancy Drew Files where we really see Nancy making out with Ned and even other guys sometimes, but Nancy and Ned get stuck on the Ferris wheel. So, that was a little bit romantic, I guess. So the next note that I have here is the distinguishing characteristics Nancy notices from the pickpocket is that he takes short, quick steps and David Dorrance takes long strides. I was like, what a weird thing to notice about somebody. I mean, it's valid, but I was just like, okay. But Nancy also has a pact with Dorrance that he'll shake a handkerchief so she knows it's him. But both men turn out to be the pickpockets. They're working together. they are basically twins. So I was like, oh my gosh. When that was revealed at the end, I was like, ugh. And Francis Baum, who is one of the pickpockets, it's so confusing to keep track of what their names actually are and what their aliases were. But he tries to make Nancy go on a date with him, and she says, I'll be very busy for some time. I absolutely love that. Like, that was so good. That was almost like saying, yeah, I gotta wash my hair. I don't care to spend any time with you, thanks. And as for the last note that I wrote down, Chief McGinnis jokingly says Nancy is an unofficial member of his staff. And I thought that was so cool because that's one of the tropes within these books is Nancy, is working very closely with the River Heights Police Department, and Chief McGinnis is really cool. Now, normally this is the part of the podcast episode where I talk about what Hannah Gruen cooked, but Hannah didn't do any cooking in this book, which was very sad. There's a few books coming up where I think she does less cooking, or it says that Nancy ate dinner, but it doesn't really specifically say what she had. So, yeah, there was no cooking really mentioned in this book. But I did come up with a few things that I think that Nancy could add to her resume, starting with Quick Draw McDrew, because Nancy disarms David Dorrance when he has that gun pointed at Carson, and I was like, that is so awesome. Like, she really thought on her feet for that one. I also put that Nancy could add to her resume that she's a model, because Catherine Kovna, the woman that Helen Archer just brings back from her vacation, she's an aspiring dressmaker, and of course, they're like, oh, Nancy, you're so beautiful. Will you wear this dress in this fashion show that River Heights is putting on? And so Nancy does. And last but not least, I said that Nancy is definitely a chase expert. She chases the pickpockets a lot in this book, and she gets sidetracked with, which one is the real one, and it turns out they both are pickpockets in the end, but she did not let up. She was just running and chasing them in cars. It was something to behold. Now on to the things that I liked about the clue in the jewel box and the things that I didn't like. So I liked that there was a cool jewel box, and I liked that there was intrigue and fun chases. There were a lot of chase scenes in this book, which kept it very interesting. But the things that I didn't like, it was too confusing. There were so many characters / doppelgangers / aliases, and it was really hard to keep that separated and figured out. Like I've said in the past on other episodes, sometimes the Nancy Drew books do a great job of this, but then sometimes they complicate matters when they're like, well, so-and-so was actually so-and-so who was actually so-and-so. It's like, no. You can have maybe one of those, one level of aliases, but you have much more than that, and it just gets really complicated. So for that reason, I gave the clue in the jewel box a rating of 2 magnifying glasses. It did have some fun parts to it that were interesting to read, but overall, the doppelgangers and aliases really confused the plot for me, so that's why I'm not rating it any higher. So that concludes today's episode. I hope you all liked discussing this book, and if you haven't read it, I suggest it. I always suggest to read any of these Nancy Drew books, even if I don't rate them highly, because you might like them more than I did. So, this is just my opinion on the books, and you may have a different opinion. But if you'd like to share those opinions or just keep up with any of the Nancy Drew related content that I post over on Instagram, you can follow me at True Drew Podcast. I would love to talk to you about the book covers or what Nancy Drew means to you, because that's been the coolest thing about starting this podcast, is just finding this community of other people that just love Nancy Drew and love solving mysteries. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Secret in the Old Attic. So if you like poisonous spiders and pirated music, this is the book for you. This book genuinely freaked me out as a kid, and I can say that it was just as scary rereading it as an adult. So I hope you all will tune in next week for that episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.